Welcome to the Men Are Forged podcast. This is Cartwright Morris, your host. Thanks for listening today. If you are interested in a coaching session with me, please log on to my website, menareforged.com, and you can click on schedule a free call, where if you got any questions actually about my coaching or even my course, you can schedule a call with me, and I'd happy to talk to you 5-10 minutes. Just, anything you'd like to know. So, but yeah, if you are interested in some coaching, life, or professional development, please go to menareforged.com, and you can click on schedule a session under my coaching page, as well as going to calvertandassociates.com and schedule an appointment with me. I do 30-minute virtual sessions, so if you don't live in the city of Birmingham or in the Birmingham area, please look me up there, and I'd love to grab a coaching session with you and see how I can help you grow, learn, and become more the man you're called to be. So anyway, menareforged.com or calvertandassociates.com. Look forward to hearing from you. Now, here's today's episode. Well, Jay, it's good to have you in. Welcome to the Men Are Forged podcast.
Cartwright, thank you for having me on.
Yeah.
Good to be with you.
So you're coming all the way from New York City. I know you're not originally from there. So I got to ask you just one question, because I literally found this out today. So I got to ask you, you just ran the New York City Marathon with 2 broken elbows. And how do you break your elbows? That's another thing I don't know nothing about.
It's such a great story to start with. So yes, we live in New York City, moved here pretty recently. And then when we moved here, my wife's brother got us electric scooters. And so electric scooters are, I always feel a little bit like I did when I was on rollerblades as a middle schooler. I'm like, I love this, but I know that people are looking at me a little bit funny. But these electric scooters are incredible. And I was on a scooter on my way down to visit my new nephew, and hit something on a sidewalk. The wheel went left and my body just continued to tumble forward and basically did a somersault. I thought I landed it fairly well. My daughter, who was behind me, said, "Dad, you look like a magical champion." But the way that I landed broke both of my elbows. And so that was on a Monday. And so spent the night in the ER waiting for the diagnosis. And then I had a conference later on that week, and then also had the New York City Marathon like 5 days later. And I didn't think I was going to be able to run it. I was in a conversation with my son.
You don't just show up to New York City.
Exactly.
You train for it.
Yeah. All summer long, kind of getting ready. And so my son, who's 8, we were in a conversation, and he was like, "How are you doing, Dad?" And I just said, "I'm bummed. I don't know if I'm going to be able to run. I'm just in too much pain." And he said, "Well, maybe you should run it." And he said, "You would either be an idiot, a fool, or a legend." And then I have a couple other friends in New York that were also running the marathon. And I don't know if you remember the Michael Jordan's flu game.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But there's a bunch of GIFs out there and different like memes. And so my friends just started bombarding me with these Michael Jordan flu game references.
Yeah.
And so I think between my son and my friends, made the decision to actually run the marathon and ran it with 2 broken elbows. So definitely went at a little slower pace than I would have wanted, and kind of gauged the real risk was that of falling again and re-injuring. So I had a call with an uncle who's a medical provider and kind of walk me through what to be aware of. And yeah, it was partially just defiance of, I want to run this thing. As you said, I'm trained, I'm ready, 30,000 people, 1 million spectators. I mean, it's such an event. And I ran it, and glad that I ran it. I'll finish with this though. But what happened afterwards was, Monday evening after the marathon, My arms were obviously still not working. They were not strong. And that was the paradox the whole time, is that my body was strong enough to run a marathon, but like that morning I couldn't get dressed. Like my wife had to get my jersey on. She had to pin up, my bib number, get my socks on. And so like there were so many things that I couldn't do because of my arms. But then the morning after the marathon, I had no access to my legs and my arms were sore. And I was like, I need to like take a bath. I need to like get some Epsom salts and I need to soak. Yeah. And I'm soaking, just enjoying it, feeling a reprieve from all the pain. And then it hits me. How in the hell am I going to get out of the bathtub? My arms don't work. My legs don't work. And so I was stuck in the bathtub for about 17, 18 minutes until I eventually kind of contorted my body enough to be able to get out of it and just barely made it up. So it's been hilarious and disappointing and all that. So,
man. So, I mean, I guess the next obvious question, but I don't know, the bathtub made me, it was like, are you a legend now? I mean, but the bathtub, imagine, humbled you or you don't feel like one.
What a fool. Yeah. I told my son, I think it's all three. It's like there's a level of just foolishness required to kind of push it and to keep going. And then there's also... I have a friend that said, I'm going to get a picture and make a poster of you for inspiration to run the marathon next year. So absolutely. I think it's a little bit of each.
Yeah. But you finished it. Yeah. I mean, good on you, man. Yeah.
Finished it. Yeah. Yeah. And just so glad that I did. I mean, I kept saying that to my friends and family that afternoon when we were hanging out. Like, I'm just so glad I ran. Yeah. So glad I ran.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, to be waiting on the sidelines or just watching it on TV or just seeing my friends do it and not be a part of it. Yeah. Would have been so disappointing.
Absolutely. That's cool. Well, I did a poor job introducing you, Jay, but Jay
That's a great introduction. I think that's my favorite introduction. I don't need to know anything else.
The legend, Jay Stringer, marathon, North marathon finisher, right here with 2 broken elbows.
Yes. Yeah.
So I do want to show my book, or your book, I should say. This is my book, but this is your book that you wrote it. Unwanted.
Yeah.
And the subtitle, it gets me every time. How sexual brokenness reveals our way to healing.
Mm-hmm.
It just, I mean, it's a funny transition. As funny as we're laughing.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive. Yeah.
It hits me so hard just because, I mean, especially in the Christian community, how we have, that is not the narrative at all, but yet Jesus teaches that. And so I guess, I'm sitting there trying to think of the question off of that. I just love that subtitle and just the whole meaning of that, and even knowing the book.
Mm-hmm.
So where did that journey begin for you in starting writing this book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those, I think, let me start with the title. So, I mean, you're right. It's counterintuitive that most of us think of sexual brokenness, a struggle with porn, buying sex, an affair, promiscuity as some kind of life sentence to sexual shame or addiction. And why I wanted to write my book was to invite people to consider that their brokenness, their struggles were actually a roadmap to healing. Yeah. And I think that's just the counterintuitive thing of like, I mean, we see this everywhere. So let's say you're struggling with anxiety. Well, we've made anxiety or something like depression bad words, right? So we need to get rid of it. We need to stop the anxiety. We need to get rid of the depression rather than actually being curious about what the anxiety is signaling, what the depression might be saying to us, and what the struggle with porn might be communicating to us. So anxiety might say, like you have been through some very difficult times and you don't know how to face the potential of that again without becoming anxious. Or maybe that depression isn't just something that is solely a chemical imbalance. Perhaps it's something that you went through something really agonizing at some point in your life, and you never had an empathetic witness. You never had someone to bear witness to the pain in your story. and you've never had a place to process that. So depression is the body's way of communicating that the system is not well. And so that's what I found in my research on about 4,000 men and women, is that unwanted sexual behavior could be shaped, if not fully predicted, based on issues in our family of origin, in our childhoods, and some of the difficulties that we are facing today. And so that's where the title comes from, is I really wanted people to get a sense of this place of shame, this place of stigma can actually become a roadmap to healing for you if you see it with new eyes. So that's the title. And then, a lot of stories inform how I got to be someone that would write a book on sexual brokenness.
Yeah. So I guess, my first question I used to ask my guests is who were your early influences? Who really shaped your thinking about masculinity, life, what success was? Yeah. Who were those? Today's episode is brought to you by Thrive Marriage Lab. If you want your marriage to thrive, this is a great opportunity to you, because strong marriages are the bedrock of strong churches, organization, families, and community. This is a 12-month pathway for any of you that are looking to really have weekly engagement with experienced marriage counselors, not just one, but many. So go to restory.life/thrive to get on the waiting list for this great program that starts in April. That's restory.life/thrive. And make sure you put the word Forge in the promo code to receive a discount on your monthly fee. Now, back to the episode.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I don't know if I have access to who it was. I think of my life in terms of like grad school, undergrad, some in high school, and then just like the blur. And so I think probably similar. I would say I didn't have a lot of influences. I think I went through a lot of life very terrified of the opposite sex, like not really understanding who I was, who my own identity. So like I knew as I liked watching TV. And so I would watch like TGIF and Family Matters, Step by Step.
Oh, that's a great 90s reference, man.
Watching, on Saturday it was Cops, America's Most Wanted, and Walker, Texas Ranger. And that was like my life. So I didn't really influence was definitely, my dad was a pastor. And so I had some level of influence there. But I would also say there was just profound silence in my community, in my family, around kind of just some of the larger issues that were happening culturally. And so it really wasn't until probably high school, late high school, undergrad, that I began to feel like I was being influenced by significant people. So I remember like when I went to college, you got you buy a Mac, you get a free iPod back in the day. And so I remember getting that iPod, and it was full of Tim Keller, N.T. Wright, and Rob Bell. So all my other friends had like 20 gigs of music, and I think I had maybe a half a gig of music, and all these, what would later be referred to me as like my audio fathers. And so that was just a lot of the theological influences of just people who taught me how to think, who allowed me to kind of process some of my own story. So influences, I don't know, TV. I watched a lot of TBS Braves baseball, so kind of Chip Carey. And so, but it wasn't until probably late high school that I felt like I even had any sense of an identity. I went to a Southern Baptist high school during puberty, which is just, an experience I would not wish on many people, maybe a few enemies. But it was toxic. There were just a lot of those metaphors, a lot of understanding of purity culture. Sexual brokenness was definitely this thing that was going to kill you. And so I won't tell the full story, but essentially one chapel speaker compared sexual pleasure to this Inuit tradition of like, basically the Inuit people would dip a dagger into seal's blood, and then this wolf would come to the dagger and lick it, and they would lick and lick and lick. And then in the morning there would be a dead wolf, because it couldn't discern what was the seal's blood versus what his own blood was. And no joke, the chapel speaker used that story to pivot it into, and a lot of you out there are masturbating, and in the morning you're going to die. And this sense of, he's speaking somewhat metaphorically about the way that sin kills you, but people were terrified. So a lot of good influences, a lot of terrible influences in my life. So
I feel like that I had the same speaker at my chapel service. I was like, I remember that story. Maybe some guy heard him and came to our school and spoke the same thing.
Yes. Well, I was talking to a friend of mine about this recently, and he said that he remembered reading it. And I can't remember which book it's in, but someone uses that as an example. And I think that example has been borrowed in just a lot of different settings. But when that example moves into purity culture, I mean, watch out. It's deadly.
Yeah. So yeah, your journey of recognizing your shame and using it like, the language I'm trying to remember how you used. I mean, like you said, shame, you said in your book, shame is not pleasure is what drives porn use.
Yeah.
So it's like, how did you start recognizing, wow, shame, I need to kind of lean into this versus we kind of as men, we try to avoid it. And when did that come in your life? Yeah.
To begin to engage shame.
Yeah, absolutely.
What you're saying. Yeah. I mean, I think of like middle school as this like prototype of hell, right? Like it is agonizing. It's awful. And so I remember just during that time, my nickname was Donut. So I showed up to middle school with a jelly donut my 7th grade year, and this jelly donut kind of dripped on my shirt. And so many TV references, but this is actually good. It means I'm in that self state of a teenager. But the Pillsbury Doughboy commercials, which if you haven't seen them, this kind of cartoon doughboy, you kind of push his belly and he goes, "Oh!" And that was my kind of nickname. And so people used to put their finger into my belly, and kind of laugh. And so that nickname Donut kind of carried forth. And again, I had a lot of shame around my body. And so where was a middle schooler supposed to go with all of that shame? Well, then I would go back home and I would eat like, Little Debbie Hostess cakes and oatmeal cream pies. Yeah. And so those cream pies and those, Doritos, Cheez-Its, all that, like that provided me relief from the shame that I was experiencing. But far more, it began to reinforce the shame about who I was. Right. And that's the point that I'm trying to make with regard to sexual shame, is that a lot of men will talk about, well, I use porn as a form of self-medicating. I use it to feel less alone in life. I do it because I'm just kind of sad and I'm, people aren't really choosing me. I feel really alone. And no doubt that unwanted sexual behavior provides that relief. But if you don't look at the other side of the coin, which is it actually provides you with irrefutable evidence that all of that shame is true, then you'll never really begin to outgrow your unwanted behavior. So it's essential for everybody to just see that like unwanted sexual behavior definitely provides relief from a life of shame, but far more, it reinforces it and kind of provides all that evidence that you are exactly who you think you are. And so it's a pivot, because I think these days we tend to think about most of those behaviors in terms of self-medicating or escape. And it's not that that's untrue, but it's a partial truth. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you talked about really high school was kind of the moment you started really engaging in this. And so what led then, I mean, I know you end up getting your MDiv, but what then started leading to be you getting into counseling and really helping others as well as just not yourself. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mentioned that my dad was a pastor. And so one of the, really formative moments for me growing up was, my dad was a pastor of a smaller Presbyterian church. And so I just have a lot of memories of, people would try and reach my father at the office, but they couldn't get a hold of him. So then they would call our home phone and leave a message. And so that answering machine was like early Netflix for me, of like, whoa, there's so much drama happening in this congregation. And that person's wetting the bed. That person just had a psychotic break. That person just had an affair. And so lots of crises happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then my dad would go and attend to these things. Well, meanwhile, part of my role in my family was to kind of begin to check in on my mom because she was losing her husband to a church and she was not too happy about that. So very early on in my life, that became something of my role in the family, is to get a sense of how is dad doing, how is mom doing, how are my siblings doing. And so that early kind of someone, I became, a counselor in training at way too early of an age. But also simultaneously began to see that, like, a lot of these people that were in crisis and sexual crisis, I had just seen them on Sunday. And then by Wednesday, I'm hearing about their porn use or an affair. And it was that sense of like people do not tell the truth about their lives in most church settings. They tell the truth of their lives through crises. And so that always fascinated me, of like, how is our shame, how are these unwanted behaviors actually telling the truth about our lives in ways that we just don't talk about that throughout so much of our day-to-day experience in relationships. So always so intrigued by that. Ended up going out to a place called the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology because there was a guy named Dan Allender there who I would say, radically changed my life, my understanding of my life. But then they had a master's in counseling program and then a master of divinity program. Gotcha. And so got involved with them. And one of those early stories, I mean, I can talk about my porn use however much you want, but definitely that's not where I would start. I would say that when I was working, or not really working, it was on basically a recruitment team for my grad school. And so we were in Denver, Colorado, and we're with a professor that was an adjunct prof. And he began, invited us to some of his lectures. We were in a bar later on that night, and he slips me a piece of paper. And on that piece of paper says, "Do you want to know who killed John Benet Ramsey?" I'm like, what? And John Benet Ramsey, the child star that was murdered, killed, mystery around her death. And I'm like, what in the world is happening? But he gave me this address to be able to meet him with. And there were some other people that had some familiarity with John Benet Ramsey's case that were meeting in this bar in downtown Denver. And so I walk in and I'm 21 years old, no, maybe 22 at the time. And he introduces me as, this is Jay Stringer, a human trafficking or a sex trafficking expert from Seattle, Washington. And I looked at him like, I don't know what sex trafficking is. What are you talking about? And then we started talking about sex trafficking and demand and sexual abuse and all these categories. And so that was just one of those early, like, life-changing conversations of, he had named me before I even knew what it was. And now that I'm something of a sex trafficking, sexual brokenness kind of expert, it still is beyond me in terms of why that story, why at that moment in my life. So I had a couple of those moments. The city of Seattle was starting a John school back in 2009-ish, right when I had graduated from grad school. And so this was a program designed to kind of invite men to understand their sexual choices. And so a lot of these John programs used to arrest women in prostitution, but then slap $100 fine on the sex buyer. And so Seattle was really trying to address and change some of this. And I got invited to be an early presenter to that John school and worked with sex buyers. And so there were just so many stories. I mean, my own sexual brokenness, my own, just a lot of involvement with porn in undergrad, grad school. These stories really just began to kind of put me on a trajectory that I never would have imagined, in middle school, high school, researching, working with men and women struggling with sexual shame and sexual brokenness. So it's been a wild ride.
Yeah, I can imagine. Golly, at 21 and walking in that bar, that's crazy. Just getting that title put on you. That's a heavy title right there.
Right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So what led to your decision to go to the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology and be under Dan Allender? What about him that really resonated with you to say, I need to spend, is it, 4-year program and really engage and really learn from him? So,
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I grew up, I'll kind of go back to early 20s, but I was in a very reformed small group, kind of the deader, the better, that if, John Calvin's going to write his Institutes by 21, he wrote the first draft at 21, 22. We were like, we're going to have them read by 21. So we read like all of Calvin, all of Luther, that phrase, the deader, the better, that was us. And in that, it just became an asshole. It just became a real jerk with regard to who I was, like needing to convert people. And I had always kind of grown up, never really able to talk about something difficult within me. It was always something like I could talk about something bad that had happened, but then I immediately needed to tell some redemptive story of how God was using it for good. And that was the pattern. Like, yeah, middle school was bad, but I also understood something of the gospel on the bus. So I could be ridiculed, beat, but like, look at what God did to me. And like, I didn't stay in heartache or trauma or difficulty for very long. I didn't suffer. I wanted to use theology and the gospel to escape that suffering. And when I met Dan, probably my senior year, it was a conference on sexual abuse, which, wasn't a category for me. But as he talked through so much of suffering, heartache, our stories beginning to kind of get real and honest, I just wept through the entire conference. Oh, wow. And he had kind of said something along the lines of, if you use resurrection to escape death, you've trivialized the cross. And so part of what he began to really invite us into is like a theology of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Good Friday is a day of crucifixion. It's a day of trauma. It's a day of sexual abuse for Jesus. Saturday is a day of hell. It's a day where a dead Messiah is a failed Messiah, and there's no promise of resurrection at all on Holy Saturday. And then obviously Easter Sunday. But part of that was just the invitation to understand that my Friday stories of trauma, heartache, my own abuse within different realms of my life were actually serving something of what Good Friday was all about. And so I think he was the first person that really began to present the gospel to me in a way that wasn't about alleviating pain or using the gospel to get out of my story. It was like, no, like the gospel is actually TNT that kind of dives deep into the wedges of our story. And so that was what made the decision to, leave. I was enrolled to go into a seminary on the East Coast, and just so glad I did not end up there. Just because I likely would have used a lot of theology to help people escape their story rather than enter deeper into it.
Man, right there. Yeah. That's how do you, like, as men, especially Christian men, we do love to use Christian language to stay at the surface, just comb over, sugarcoat. And what is the invitation really to men to go deeper, to find, to know more of their story, to understand more of the redemption narrative? We'll actually have better content if we can actually start going deeper. And so, how do as men do that? How do we dive into that?
For me, it comes to this notion of honor and honesty that I write about in my book. So those two concepts of what does it mean for you to honor your family, but also be honest about them. And so many of us have believed the lie that if I was honest about my family, honest about my suffering, I could not really honor my family. Or if I chose to honor my mother, father, faith community, I could not ever be honest about them. And I think part of what's lovely about scripture is that, like, we know that Abram and Abraham later left everything that God had commanded him to leave in order to kind of go into this new land of promise, right? So we know that he was the father of our faith, but we also know that he attempted to traffic his wife twice. We also know that, the first family, Sarai, essentially commits an assault against Hagar in Genesis 16. And that assault drives an Egyptian teenage mistress out into the wilderness. So, this is like Netflix level drama happening in scripture. But when we talk about our own families, we don't talk honestly about like, oh yeah, my dad did better than his dad. And my mom, like, yeah, maybe she cared a little bit too much about how our house looked, but she was, she made all my lunches growing up. And it's that sense of like, it's such a boring story. Like, give me the story when your dad flipped a table. Give me the story when you realized that there was a breakdown in your mother and your father's marriage, and you realized that you were on the hook to be able to kind of help your mom or your dad through that. So no family is without drama, but most of us try to tell a story in a way that's somewhat honoring of our family, but we don't ever enter honestly with regard to what's happening. And the reason why that's so important is if you can't be honest about the ways that others have harmed you, you're never going to fully be honest with yourself about the nature of your own life and your own integrity issues and difficulties. So we have a difficult time, especially in the church community, of being honest with ourselves, but much more being honest about places that we have suffered. So just as a general rule, it's always easier to talk about your own sin than it is to talk about the ways that sin has been done against you. And that is really what changed my life, was instead of just kind of always thinking about myself as the main person that needed to change, when I began to enter into like, no, my mom and my dad both used me profoundly in the midst of some of the difficulties of their life. That's really where my heart began to break. And then I could connect the dots between my past pain and some of my current sin. Right. And that was a really necessary bridge for me, was to connect present struggles with past pain.
Yeah. Like learning to have compassion for yourself was such a new thing for me, of like, wow, how come I'm not giving myself grace, but I'll give anybody else grace who has completely sinned against me, but not myself.
Exactly.
It's like, man. So that is one of your more powerful quotes in your book that I use all the time, is the genuine
Which
mark.
Which one is that?
Genuine mark of maturity is the ability to hold two truths simultaneously. And that honor and honesty, which is a powerful, like I say story because it's a real person's life that you counseled, is her, it was a woman who she was abused by her father, but yet her mom was still holding up this honor towards him. And therefore she couldn't truly get healing within the family because of this. And it's like, man, it's like, that was the perfect example of what you just said. And so,
needing to protect the family name.
And that's
where I think Jesus is saying, like, unless you leave your mother and father, you cannot leave me. Unless you hate your father and mother. That's a really strong word. And so what he's getting at is it's this issue of loyalty. That if your loyalty is really for your mother and father at the cost of being honest about what you've suffered with them, you're never going to be able to follow Jesus into a new life, because you're very loyal to defending your old family system. And so this is actually like a call to differentiation, to individuation. And that's just one of those really, really necessary things in early adulthood, is to be able to separate from your mother and father.
Man, it's insane. Yeah, exactly. In all ways, right? Like I
always,
when I coach certain guys who have not financially broken from their parents, you could see it, and it affects them in other areas. It's insane. Just even the financial tie to their parents. Yeah.
They get some leverage, which I'm all for some level of, if they want to invest in your own therapy or coaching or
see it as a gift.
Cartwright services, those are great.
Thank you.
So
Jack, say that again.
Or you can do an intensive with me if your mother and father want to pay for it.
Absolutely.
But that sense of like, yeah, like we need to be able to leave emotionally, right? So the gods of your mother and father, what did they care about? Was it work? Was it order? Was it a cleanly house? And there's a lot that we can honor them
Yeah.
for. I mean, I think of my dad. I grew up with my dad, with kind of walking by my dad's bedroom and kind of seeing 5 or 6 books on his bedside table that address psychology, theology, some level of story.
Mm.
And so I grew up with a dad who integrated psychology and faith and kind of showed me, mapped out how to do that. So a lot of my eyes in terms of how I see the human heart, how I see, integration, how I see beauty, how I understand the work of the gospel is completely informed by my dad. And I can honor him for that. But I also, at the same time, have to say he also left me hungering for a father. I wanted so much more. And so that's really that intersection of, you know, I want to honor my dad for what he has offered to me. But in my honesty with regard to wanting more from my dad, I actually understand more of God's fathering and mothering of me in my own life. And that's what this is all about is, you know, God wants your mom, your dad. Why? Because he wants to father and mother you. And that's a big transition.
Yeah. Wow. So jumping back into your story, what ended up leading to you writing this book? So, I mean, you're counseling all these people.
Mm-hmm.
And then this led to you having these real intimate, traumatic stories where people are walking out their healing. And so what led to you then turning it into a book?
Yeah, a lot of it was just the pattern recognition of being able to see some of the same stories. So what I opened my book with is this story of this guy who is cruising around the streets of Seattle. He's buying sex, and kind of, I just asked him in a counseling session, essentially like, tell me about kind of just the ritual that you have in buying sex. And he said, you know, essentially, don't get me wrong. I buy sex for the power of it, for the pleasure of it. But he said, what I love to do is just get in my SUV and cruise around the streets of Seattle and try and lock eyes with women. And I said, that's really intriguing phrase, like lock eyes with women. And so as we began to kind of process his story over the next, you know, week or two, he talked about how so much of his life kind of grew up as a latchkey kid, like just, you know, no one was home. He was home a lot by himself, a lot of abandonment issues. And so at one point in his life, his parents got him a Schwinn bicycle. And he said, Jay, I loved that bike. And I said, what did you love about it? And he said, I used to cruise around my neighborhood, just trying to lock eyes with girls in my class. And, you know, he said it, and I just kind of said, like, there's the cruising. It used to be an SUV, or it used to be a bike, and now it's an SUV. And that was really the moment where kind of the light bulb went up and the tears began to fall. Like he began to get a sense of like how his story of abandonment had really set up this kind of life of cruising that was so innocent, full of longing as a middle schooler, but then eventually grew into a pattern that he was really ashamed of. And so I would, you know, hear a story like that, and then you read a lot of the literature, a lot of the other books out there, and it's all about like crucify the desires of the flesh and try this internet monitoring service and like really practical suggestions. And I'm like, this is not resonating at all with me. It doesn't resonate at all with the people that I'm counseling. And so I would say most of Christianity is kind of obsessed with this lust management model, and that's a slap a rubber band around your wrist, get that internet monitoring, get into accountability if you're really struggling. But as a friend of mine said to me when I was writing my book, he said, Jay, if I've been having the same conversation with my accountability partner for 15 years, something isn't working.
Right.
And so that was kind of the decision to do some research and begin to write about the 3 questions of my book are, you know, how did I get here? Why do I stay? And how do I get out? And so everybody buys the book because they want to get out. They want that 3rd question. But until you answer those first 2 questions, there's not a lot of hope to outgrow that behavior. Because you've got to understand, you know, your origin stories, where you come from. And then secondly, you need to understand how that compulsive behavior or addiction has come to serve you despite its consequences. So I took all that, did some research, wanted to get a sense of what was driving all of this. And I also looked at something called the arousal template, which is basically, when you get on Google, when you get on a porn site, what do you actually seek out in porn? And so my research found that, your sexual fantasies could be shaped, if not fully predicted, based in some of these unresolved stories in your life as well. And so, yeah, I had a lot of fun with the book. I mean, it was a lot of work, but to me, it was just fascinating that we could actually predict porn searches based in people's stories. And so, part defiance of why is there so much just kind of crap out there to address this. And then also just that level of desire of what can we learn from these behaviors that we don't yet already know?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. And one of the things that was so just huge for me was just the whole idea of anger and lust. The redemptive thing behind anger is injustice, and the thing behind lust is belonging. How did you discover that? Where was that personal to you? Was that something you found in the research? Where'd you find that out?
I mean, I would say that that's like out of Matthew 5. So when Jesus kind of describes the nature of sin as being an issue of lust and anger, he's saying that we need to address both. And so James 4 takes it even further, which says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Well, you want something and you don't get it, so you kill. And just seeing that pattern a lot with, we want really good things. So that sense of lust, if we look at the root of lust, it is that desire of, I want something good. I want to belong. I want to be filled. I want to be connected with. And yet, if we don't get that thing that we desire, James 4 says you actually end up killing for it. And Jesus calls that murder, right? And so at the, unwanted sexual behavior has to be addressed through that kind of twofold lens of, yes, there is lust happening, but at the same time, there's a tremendous amount of anger. And so the example that I use is to kind of think about the Mississippi River. And so again, just really powerful, large river. And the reason why it's powerful isn't just because it's one single river. The reason it's powerful is because there's a lot of other major rivers that kind of flow into that as different tributaries. So we have the Missouri, the Arkansas, the Tennessee, handful of others that I don't recall. But that sense of like, if you want to address the Mississippi, you aren't going to understand the Mississippi if you don't understand the role of the Missouri and the Tennessee. And so that would be very similar to unwanted sexual behavior, is that most of Christianity has been like, if we can just stop the tributary of lust and just kind of cut it off, then we'll be able to solve unwanted behaviors. And it's like, no, that's like one of 6, 7 tributaries that flows into it. And so that was kind of just in my clinical work, recognizing this lust model is not working. And it's giving people the illusion that if they could just stop it, they could heal unwanted behavior. And that's just, it's not true. There's a lot of other factors that flow into it.
Yeah. Jay, I keep having this question pop up, and it's one of those simultaneous truths here in my mind, like just the church, meaning the body of Christ, the bride. And then underneath that is the organization of the church, and especially the American church. And do you find that tension with you sometimes? I mean, in your own life, and even just seeing some of the fallacies of it, is it hard to sometimes want to point stuff out? But where is the solution here in us being, as the body of Christ, being a representation of Jesus's hands and feet, like being part of the solution here in this time in our history? So how do you judge balance that?
So many, great question. So many different answers to that. I think part of it is that we have kind of consigned sexual brokenness into a basement issue for men. And it's like, no, unwanted sexual behavior, like about 1/3 of all pornography users are now women. a lot of affairs. And so this sense of like trying to manage something is at the root of so much of the difficulties that we find ourselves in. So I think real community, that if we are actually image bearers of God, what do we see God doing throughout the Old Testament? Well, God tabernacles, God incarnates God's self into places of human weakness and misery. And so the implication is, if we are to be on the lookout for the arrival of God, where should we be looking? In the broken stories of humanity. And so when Adam and Eve have just eaten of the tree that they were commanded not to eat from, God doesn't show up and say, Adam, I get that apple is kind of tempting. So let's just bounce your eyes from the next piece of fruit that comes along. Yeah. It's not, God isn't trying to give a practical suggestion. God says, where are you? And to Hagar, who's just been traumatized by Sarah, the question is, where do you come from? Where are you going? So I think the church needs to be a place for us to be able to process our stories, to be able to talk through not just our brokenness, but the stories that actually informed how we got there to begin with. And so I think that's the real healing in community, is that we are harmed in relationships, but we also are healed in the context of relationships. And I think that's how the church can become something of a new community, a new template, where the old way of relationships were about hiding and shame and rigidity. But this new community that's being formed around the person of Christ is this community where we can talk about the difficulties, the antagonists, the sin in our lives, and understand that that is precisely the place where the gospel longs to meet us.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's interesting. Yeah. I mean, just even studying Genesis 1, that God hovered over the waters and then it was formless and void, meaning chaos. It's like God loves bringing in order out of chaos, but yet for some reason, Christian, he's like, he only wants order. We got to stay in order. It's like, no, chaos. He loves the chaos.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And such a boring story if it's only order. I mean, there's I mean, you look at all the just even creation creatures. I mean, there are some bizarre species out there in the underworld, in the ocean, on land, and it's that sense of like, it's not boring. There's so much variety. There's goodness. There's play everywhere. So. Yeah.
I mean, like scientists, they're still trying to figure out the platypus, right? Where to categorize it, right? Mammal.
What is it? Yes. Yeah.
So
exactly.
So yeah, Jay, I mean, really, for the guy out there, it's like, well, how do I start digging into my story? How do I start really unpacking and understanding more? How do I maybe put honor down and pick up some more honesty? How does that make?
So, I mean, being able to have a guide that can help walk you through this is so crucial. So whether that's a coach, a therapist, a pastor, a mentor, and again, a lot of times shame is going to tell you something about yourself that's not true. It's going to be, if you actually open your mouth about this, every word that you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. And shame is just a toxic narrator. So we have to begin to kind of swim towards that shame and begin to disempower it. But then when we find ourselves in a community, really, I mean, pick up Unwanted. I also have a sexual behavior self-assessment that's rooted in all the research. And so you can take that. It's about 160 questions, and it's going to give you compass headings about how your story is shaping your unwanted behaviors. Get into a group and begin to talk through, I don't understand why I do what I'm doing, but I'm beginning to get a sense that my family, my childhood experiences, one of the research findings that we found was that men with a lack of purpose were 7 times more likely to pursue unwanted sexual behavior than those who had a lot of purpose. So again, if you don't have purpose in your life, you are 7 times more likely to pursue porn than the other guy next to you who has a really clear sense of purpose. So even that is an issue of, this isn't just lust. It's that you're bored. You look back at your life and you see a lot of failures, and your life has become kind of that abandoned house that a squatter has come to dwell in. And so for you to take authority, authorship, ownership of your life again means that you might need to kick pornography out so that you actually can get a sense of what you want to fill your life with. And so there's so many different categories that unwanted sexual behavior can reveal our way to healing for. It could be purpose, it could be childhood wounds, really any number of things. So get into community, get curious about why you do what you do. Don't just pathologize it. The church loves to pathologize almost everything. And so resist that pull, get super curious about your sexual life.
Yeah, that curiosity, leaning, that's interesting. Yeah, I like even just like you said earlier of like what you look at in pornography, the curious part of that, that's the connection point. That's something long ago that there's that tagline through your life, and that's a way to redemption. Yeah. Like I love the last line of your book. Even there was one of the guys I think you even mentioned earlier was the wildness or the untamedness of my story. Actually, I discovered the beauty of it. Like learning to find the beauty of all of everything. Like that's what I like the narrative. Like God wastes nothing; He absolutely wastes nothing. So that's just such a beautiful.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I think that's like so true of us as men. Is that like if you struggle with sexual shame, you struggle with desire, right? And so desire, we end up thinking that like there's something wrong with my desires. There's something wrong with who I am. That if I was ever just completely unleashed, I would be involved in so much sexual garbage that, my life would just be torn apart. Yeah. And I think what that reveals is that we are actually in a civil war with desire, because we actually want, when you really begin to press people about what they want in their own life beyond just kind of fame or money or notoriety, it's like they want beauty. They want friends. They want something that cannot be put fully into words. It's that longing that may or may never come. And so I think that's the real work for people, is to not feel like there's, the enemy is not your desire. And if you struggle with sexual sin, sometimes you begin to believe that. Desire is actually trying to free us. It's trying to wake us up to what all is possible with regard to our lives. And to get a sense of what do we want to do with this wild, beautiful life that we've been given. And that's the invitation to all of this, is not just to say no to unwanted sexual behavior, but to really ask, what would your freedom be for? And that's, Galatians 5 it is for freedom that you have been set free. Yeah. And so that's what we need to be asking, is not just a life free from sexual brokenness, but really, if brokenness wasn't part of your life and porn wasn't stealing all of your joy, what would you actually be free to accomplish?
Wow. That's so good. I mean, just even I think of a story of a married friend of mine. It's like my brain space is just so free and open that because I'm not single anymore. Just that ability that and especially when it comes to porn use, like it really is creating things in our brain. And if we just put that aside, what could our creative space, what could God really, what we're here to put on the earth for? So that's really cool.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I always ask my guests this question because a lot of my audience is kind of young men in their 20s and 30s. So what do you know now that you wish you knew at 25?
Oh, I feel like that I almost need to narrow in how many things I would say to my 25-year-old self. I mean, like the male brain is not fully developed until 26. And so I think there's like that sense of being able to have compassion on like, just things are developing. Like 25 is in some ways like a delayed adolescence, where you're still kind of loyal to your family. You're still trying to figure out your own identity. And so just to kind of be very kind to yourself in the midst of that would be something that I wish I knew. But also, like, I think I grew up, I think just a lot of bullying, never really knowing my strength. I think I always grew up with a lot of my life kind of feeling like I was this broken down Toyota inside, where, if people really got to know me, they just really wouldn't be impressed or enjoy me. There's something kind of always flawed, ugly, indulgent about who I was. And so I think I believed that until about 25, 26, 27 years old. And then just had some good friends invite me into different experiences. I would say even with like running, climbing Mount Rainier. And I just got to see like that my body could do really hard things.
Yeah.
And, you know, for a kid that had been bullied for weight, to be able to kind of see his body run, there was a sense of like, there is something of a horse within me that can go long and far.
Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of what that's been the goodness of, you know, early 30s, mid 30s, is that sense of like all these lies that I believed the first 2.5 decades of my life really need to be challenged. And I think good friends have helped me to see that. Good therapy has helped me to see that. But I think it's maybe what I'm trying to say in all of that is that, you know, a lot of what you might believe about yourself at 25 might be completely wrong. And you need to begin to kind of get some good guides, have some new experiences to be able to shape that trajectory. Just because, I mean, life had very little joy and delight those first few decades. I mean, definitely with friends here and there, but there was this overall sense that something about me is just kind of a broken down vehicle.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. And then realize, that's so good. And then, I mean, so much of that, I resonate in my own story of just like thinking that my life is this lane and it's all figured out at 25, and just how foolish that is. I have so much more life to live and to do and to be. And similarly, I climb Mount Rainier. So that was.
Oh, you did? Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of those identities are who our family system, our church system kind of needed us to be. So whether you were the scapegoat or the golden child, sometimes that sense is like, this is a role that I've been asked to play, that I need to outgrow, that I don't want to kind of be in anymore. And so I mean, I love that language of lane of, there's a whole highway, there's a whole wilderness to be able to get into. And this lane, that misery, that shame that you're feeling might be like the road has become too small for you. You need something more, not so much that you're just not worth the time. And there's something about you just not able to drive. It's just not true.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Cause I mean, going back to my first question, I think that's why I asked that is we see one person, we think this is success, and I've got to fit between some way into that lane. And it's like, no, there's success is way out here, and it's defined every day. You know, it's like, that's cool.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, that's this understanding of this is what I'm supposed to be. And I think that's where I laugh pretty consistently about the work that I do with men and women dealing with sexual brokenness. I mean, it's like the notion of like growing up, wishing I was, when I would watch TV and Braves baseball, and just like getting to like, wish I was just a professional athlete. And, you know, in my work, I work with a handful of professional athletes who struggle with unwanted sexual behavior. And it's like, I'm so glad I don't have their life of all this pressure, all this identity wrapped up into that. And so this like very kind invitation of, I thought my shame, my sexual shame, my body shame would just be barriers to everything I wanted to do in life. But the reality is the exact opposite. Like my shame, my heartache, my stories that I haven't known what to do with have actually been the very soil through which God has come to give me the life that I have. And I don't know what to do with that. But I know at some level, on some days, in some years, God is committed to my good. I don't believe that every year. But there are some years where it's undeniable, and other years where I fight because I don't believe that God is good. But that's the war, is God committed to my good, to my flourishing? And some years I would say yes. Other years I would say, not this year.
Man. That's good, Jay. Thank you. Any content? I know your course. I'd love you just mention that to my listeners and just hear that before you go.
So the Journey course is a 5-month program that if you're kind of ready to take that next step, like read Unwanted, see if that resonates, and then that sense of like go deeper into your story. So it's a 5-month program. I don't know. There are a lot of coaches, therapists that run these groups across the country. And so there's, different groups to be able to join, but it's going to basically invite you to understand your story. Yeah. So it's going to get you into your family of origin, adverse childhood experiences, the things that you find arousing, and then help you build a life that you don't constantly need to escape from. So it's a really good thing to do with an accountability partner, a friend, a therapist, a coach. It includes the sexual behavior self-assessment as well, but it helps you identify and transform the key drivers in your unwanted behaviors. So it's a good one if you want to go deeper beyond unwanted. Yeah,
that's good. So two things that you like invites you into understanding your story and be in relationship with your story with others, right? Like how powerful that is. It's a beautiful thing. And what's the website?
So my website is jay-stringer.com, and you can find all those resources there, or I'm on Instagram as well.
Yeah. So. Great. Well, thank you for coming, Jay. I appreciate it.
Yeah, Cartwright. Good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Men Are Forged podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, go to Apple Podcasts. Please rate and review Men Are Forged podcast, as well as go to menarforged.com and subscribe to the email list and receive up-to-date interview show notes. Thank you for listening.